The most influential systems in your life are the ones you rarely notice. They shape what feels natural, what feels possible, and what rarely comes into question. This is Tom Speaks. Short transmissions on thought, perception, and the mechanics of how we experience reality. Every society relies on systems it rarely examines. Electric grids hum behind walls. Financial networks reconcile numbers across continents. And traffic algorithms orchestrate flows of vehicles that never see the logic directing them. Most participants interact only with the surface. A light switch, a payment confirmation, a green signal. Beneath the surface lies structure, and that structure determines what moves easily and what encounters friction. It also determines what becomes visible and what remains abstract. Over time, it begins to accumulate authority. Authority is often imagined as a person issuing commands. In practice, it frequently resides in design. The shape of a form determines what can be expressed. The layout of a platform shapes which voices are amplified, and the categories in a database influence what counts as real. When systems stabilize, they begin to appear natural. Defaults feel neutral, interfaces feel inevitable, and users gradually adapt their behavior to the contours provided. Over time, the distinction between how things are and how things were built becomes difficult to perceive. This is not inherently negative. Systems enable scale, coordinate strangers, and reduce cognitive load. A well-designed structure allows complex activity without requiring every participant to understand the whole. However, the quiet authority of systems carries a particular risk: invisibility. When a decision is embedded in code rather than spoken aloud, it becomes less contestable. When a ranking emerges from an algorithm rather than a committee, it appears impersonal, and that impersonality can easily be mistaken for objectivity. Yet every system reflects choices. Thresholds are set, variables are weighted, and categories are defined. What is optimized becomes prioritized, while what is not measured tends to fade into the background. These decisions are rarely malicious. They are usually pragmatic, shaped by constraints of time, budget, and feasibility. But once architecture is deployed, it begins to influence behavior at scale. Consider feedback loops. A system that promotes content based on engagement will naturally amplify what provokes reaction. Over time, users adapt to this dynamic and begin producing material that is more likely to trigger measurable responses. The system appears to prefer certain styles, but that preference is simply an artifact of design interacting with human incentive. The result is not a conspiracy. It is convergence. A similar pattern appears in risk assessment tools. When historical data reflects patterns shaped by inequality, predictive systems trained on that data may reproduce those same patterns. The output reflects correlations rather than ethical reflection, yet it may still be treated as authoritative because it is computational. The authority of systems tends to arise from a combination of scale, consistency, and opacity. Scale allows a single rule to affect millions of people. Consistency creates predictability and builds trust, and opacity limits how many people can meaningfully interrogate the mechanism. Together, these elements create a kind of structural gravity. This gravity does not require intention. It emerges through repetition. It is important to distinguish between agency and influence. A system does not possess motives. It simply executes processes according to its design and inputs. However, its influence can still shape incentives, distribute resources, and frame perception in powerful ways. Human agency remains upstream. Designers choose objectives, organizations define success metrics, regulators determine oversight, and users ultimately decide whether and how to participate. The challenge arises when responsibility diffuses across these layers. One person may focus on efficiency, another on growth, and another on short-term outcomes. No single individual intends harm, yet the aggregate effect can still be significant. Distributed authorship, in this sense, extends far beyond writing. It characterizes modern infrastructure itself, where outcomes are co-produced by architects, implementers, users, and the histories embedded in data. Attribution becomes complex. The solution is not to abandon systems. At contemporary scale, structured coordination is necessary. The task instead is to render their authority visible. Visibility begins with language. When we describe a system as designed rather than natural, we reintroduce a sense of contingency. Documenting decision criteria makes trade-offs legible, and publishing evaluation metrics allows for external scrutiny. Transparency alone does not guarantee fairness, but opacity guarantees distance. Another important dimension is adaptability. Rigid systems tend to accumulate mismatch as environments change, while flexible systems can incorporate feedback and revise their objectives and constraints over time. This capacity to update reduces the risk of fossilized assumptions. Finally, there is the question of literacy. As more aspects of social life are mediated through technical systems, a basic understanding of how those systems function becomes part of civic competence. This does not require everyone to read source code, but it does require an awareness that design shapes experience. The quiet authority of systems is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. Instead, it operates through defaults, rankings, permissions, and probabilities, becoming most visible when it fails or when outcomes contradict expectations. In those moments, the underlying architecture briefly comes into view. In distributed environments, power rarely sits in a single place. It flows through design choices, data patterns, and incentive structures. Recognizing this does not diminish human responsibility, it clarifies it. Systems extend human capability across scale. They amplify intention, bias, efficiency, and oversight alike. The question is not whether they influence collective life, because they already do. The more relevant question is whether their authority will remain quiet. Rendering it audible requires examination. Rendering it accountable requires participation, and rendering it adaptable requires a degree of humility. Structure is inevitable. Naturalization is not.